When I have an introduction like that, it sounds like I've never been able to keep a job anywhere for very long. But I have, I was thinking yesterday, I came, as of next month, I came to Indonesia, to Asia 50 years ago. In fact, the first time I came was in Singapore in 1967, and you can imagine how different it was then. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for having a stream this year, a track related to early childhood education. I'm going to be focusing a bit more broadly on early childhood care and development. I think it's very important. The sessions yesterday, however, were not terribly well attended, about 30 people or so, but I would hope that as time goes on, perhaps because of some of the things I'll be talking about, there'll be greater interest in the future in this important field. What I want to talk about are some core messages first. First, good quality, comprehensive, integrated early childhood care and development programs are essential for the well-being of young children, for their future success in education, and for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm just curious, could you raise your hand? How many of you have heard about the Sustainable Development Goals? Okay, not enough, but that's another PowerPoint. We'll get into that some other time. Secondly, ECCD programs must be genuinely inclusive, and I was happy to hear the chair for the day talking about some of the sessions that will come up later. Available to all young children and a special focus on the most disadvantaged. If you look at statistics and data about enrollment in early childhood programs, you'll find in many countries in this region, if you're in the upper quintile of the population, your child is 10 times more likely to be in some kind of preschool than if you belong to a family in the lowest quintile of the population. So there's a huge issue of exclusion and disadvantage. Third, ECC programs are also important in achieving an education system which is inclusive. We talk a lot about getting children ready for school, but school readiness also means getting schools ready for children, ready to receive the children. The problem, of course, many of you might face is children coming out of a play-based, child-centered preschool and entering into a non-play-based, non-child-centered primary school. You'll see the importance then of getting schools also ready to receive with ease children of all kinds. Now, what is it? Well, a more common definition now around the world is that early childhood care and development really encompasses, as an age group, birth to 8 years. Some talk about even -9 from the point of conception to 8 years. Why 8 years instead of 5 or 6? It's because of the increasing importance seen in this transition period from preschool into early grades of primary school and into successful early learning. The World Health Organization talks about the importance of the first 1,000 days of a child's life. That's not 0 to 3, it's -9 to 2 actually, and it becomes very important therefore. As an outcome, this defines a child as being, in UNICEF's phrase, physically healthy, mentally alert, emotionally sound, socially competent, and ready to learn. But early childhood care and development is also a process. It covers from pregnancy through the successful transition from the home or from the preschool into the early grades of primary school, and therefore into a strong foundation for future learning. Now, why is it important? Well, we have this Sustainable Development Goal. These were approved in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly, all nations of the world, to take the place of what were called the Millennium Development Goals. And Goal 4 relates to education. And 4.2 says this: all nations of the world should, by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development care and pre-primary education so that they are ready for primary education. We're talking now globally, maybe only about 60% of the children of the world actually go to some kind of preschool program, many not of good quality. There are two indicators for this goal that countries of the world are asked to measure, some will not measure both of them, but it's important that they try to at least. One is the percentage of children under 5 who are developmentally on track in terms of health, learning, and psychosocial well-being. So it's not only health and nutrition of young children, it's not only learning preschool children, it's developmentally on track across a full range of child development measures. But the second one is this one. It's easier to measure, and more countries have opted to do this, to measure this. Participation rate in 1 year of organized learning before the official primary entry age by sex. So this is saying all countries of the world by 2030 should guarantee that all children have at least 1 year of pre-primary education before they enter the formal education system. For many countries where you're at a 10% enrollment rate, this is not going to be easy. For other countries, and other countries have almost already achieved it. I might add that there are 16 other sustainable development goals, and early childhood development is seen as being essential to the achievement of those goals related to things like nutrition and health, women's economic empowerment, access to water and sanitation, inequality, the values and behaviors that can reduce violence and promote peace. So 4.2 stands by itself, but it's also seen that its achievement will be essential in helping to achieve many of the other sustainable development goals. Now, why invest in it? Well, based on evidence from neuroscience, and especially the last 10 years or so, genetics and population studies, it's now considered that early childhood is in fact the most important developmental phase in the human lifespan. It means that inadequate early childhood care and development leads later to serious individual social costs. If you don't go to good quality early childhood care and development programs, if you grow up in families where there is stress, poor health, poor nutrition, poor care, it's likely in the future that you as an individual will have poorer health and nutrition, there will be higher rates of infant mortality, lower levels of educational achievement, and in fact, greater unemployment. And there have been studies, longitudinal studies over 30 years or so in many parts of the world that in fact show this, show the long-term impact of good quality early childhood care and development programs. And the fact that preventive early interventions yield higher returns compared to later remedial services. So if you start early, it's easier to have impact. That doesn't mean that those of you who are concerned with children in upper preschool, kindergarten, or primary school should give up, in fact, because these early years are so important. But it just tries to make the point that if you start early, you have higher returns compared to investments in later remediation. So there is a brain development argument. And again, the neuroscience of the last 10 years is important in this regard. The most rapid period of brain development occurs in the first few years of life. It's said that about 80% of the brain, in terms of its wirings, connections, is already developed by the time a child is 3 years old, 90% by the time the child is 5 years old. It means, therefore, that a nurturing and stimulating environment and the quality of early life experience, compassion, care, consistent caregiving, good health and nutrition, cognitive stimulation, language stimulation, all of these things increase numerically the number of a child's brain cells, the number of connections among them, and the way that these are wired, and thus increase the potential for learning. So it's important when we look at early childhood care and development. There are reasons for talking about this being child-centered and play-based because it promotes stimulation of various kinds as well as other outcomes that are important. Plus, the influence of a child's early environment and of its brain development is long-lasting. There are studies now in neuroscience that talk about what's called toxic stress. Okay, if children before the age of 3 are brought up in an environment which is abusive, filled with conflict, violence, whether in the home or in the local environment. There is a certain toxic stress syndrome that results, chemical reactions in the body that have an impact on the development of the brain, and that this is in fact very serious. Therefore, even greater importance to worry about child protection issues, especially young children, and the kind of environment they're being raised in. This is quite a famous study out of Harvard University that looks at human brain development. About halfway on the line below, the first bit is months, and then you get into years. You can see that by year 5 or so, in terms of brain development linked to sensory pathways, language, and even higher cognitive function, have basically reached their peak, after which there is still some growth and development, but the highest rate of growth and development of these functions occur, in fact, before the age of 5. So that's the brain development argument. The economic argument, well, as I've said, returns on investment in early childhood care and development accumulate over time, and they help to offset poverty and inequality later in life. There's a famous long-term cost-benefit analysis called High Scope program in the US about preschools, showed that by the age of 27, $1 invested in good quality early childhood resulted in a return in terms of social costs of $7. By age 40, the return had increased to $17. So when you hear ministries of education or social welfare or finance saying, we don't have money for early childhood programs, you say, well, in fact, the more money you put into early child programs, the more money you're going to save in the future. And providing quality care and education, opportunities for young children and their families, especially among those most at risk, is the most powerful strategy for breaking what we call this intergenerational cycle of poverty. Grandparents to parents to children, the lack of stimulation, poor health, malnutrition, toxic stress. This can, in fact, go from generation to generation, and an intervention in that process at an early age of young children can help to break that cycle. There's also this example, again, from James Heckman, a Nobel laureate for economics. Early childhood development is a smart investment. The earlier investment, the greater return. So on the left is the rate of return for investments related to human capital development. And if you look at the rate of return, for example, $1 at the prenatal phase, or 0 to 3, or even 4 to 5, you'll see the rate of return is much higher than the same dollar being invested in formal schooling, job training, post-school activities. So again, a good rationale with finance ministries why more money should go into early childhood. This is not often the case. If you look at the percentage of education budgets or national budgets around the world that go into early childhood, it's often very small. If you look at the amount of money spent per university student compared to the amount of money spent per preschool child, you'll see a huge difference, and that is one of the problems that we face. There's also the health argument. Investments in early childhood care and development programs save money. Again, they lower health costs for young children and their mothers, reduce the number of high-risk parents, both now and in the next generation. We're talking about, again, if you're looking at early childhood care and development programs beginning in the prenatal period, this leads to better health of the mother and of the new child. They also decrease emergency and hospital services. They reduce the costs of nutrition services, especially for young children, and they lead, in fact, to fewer developmental delays and disabilities. So if you're talking about at a kindergarten or grade 1 level trying to diagnose delays and disabilities, some of them could have been prevented or mitigated by adequate, well-funded, good quality early childhood development services. The cultural argument. Well, ECC programs should be embedded in local culture, okay, and should be delivered, if at all possible, in mother tongue. If they do so, they can have a strong impact on cultural identity and self-esteem, the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, and the future participation of these often minority, less empowered linguistic and ethnic groups. So it's important if you're going to develop early childhood development programs to try to ensure that at least they are done in the mother tongue, so the children are learning the most from them, so that their parents can understand as well what the children are going through in those programs. This leads to a whole other issue about the language of mother tongue in formal education, but at least in early childhood we should be focusing on this important issue. And finally, the education argument. Okay? Successful early learning leads to successful later learning. If you start learning well in terms of cognitive linguistic development at a young age, if you look at the importance of emergent or pre-literacy being provided well in good quality programs before primary education, you have a better chance of trying to promote successful later learning. Early failure creates later failure, and that's the idea of not trying to force literacy on children before they are, if you will, psychologically ready for it. And that's one of the problems I think many of you face, pressures from parents and from the government to try to push for literacy early on, especially in English very often, when in fact for many children they're simply not able or ready at that time to do it. Thus they become slow learners, slow readers, and eventually have unsuccessful learning. And again, a cost-effective issue. Good quality early childhood care and development results in cost savings and increased efficiency. There's higher attendance. Children who go to preschools are more likely to enroll in primary schools. Lower repetition and dropout. If they have good quality preparation and readiness for school, they will likely repeat less and drop out less. Less remedial and special education will be needed because possible delays and disabilities would have been identified and perhaps assisted early on, and eventually higher educational attainment. Children stay in school longer and succeed more. Two more final points. And the little timer on my TV screen fell off, so I can't tell how much time I have left. But I think I can fit it in 20 minutes. And as the chair mentioned, the idea of early childhood care and development for inclusion. Okay? It's essential in order to achieve a truly inclusive education system. We're talking about programs which are comprehensive, looking at all aspects of a child development, that are integrated, that are trying to lead to the holistic development of children. So starting early by promoting within families and in all CCD programs adequate nutrition and health care, psychosocial support, and cognitive stimulation. That's important. Seeking out those most subject to exclusion. Okay? How many schools, your own schools, primary schools, actually proactively look for children who are not likely to be enrolled and to get them enrolled? I've done studies recently in Cambodia and Indonesia where one can expect a certain percentage of a population of children to have delays and disabilities, and there are virtually none in school. Well, they're not being counted, they're invisible. So to what extent is it important to seek out those most subject to exclusion? In some cases, girls, in fact, more often at certain levels of the system, boys. Children with disabilities living in remote places, in poor families, from ethnic linguistic minorities, and actually prepare them adequately for school. And as I said, developing child-centered, play-based, and mother tongue ECCD programs. There are studies which show, for example, that again, children from families from the upper 20% of income by the age of 3 or 5 have heard quantitatively 10 times more words and have a vocabulary 10 times larger than children who come from families in the lower 20% income bracket. So this focus on the excluded, the disadvantaged, and the attempt to try to improve their life chances becomes very important. Finally, a summary. ECCD increases the sustainability and the equity of development. This is individual development, it's social and national development. Interventions in early childhood care and development programs have sustainable and long-term effects, again, not only on the individual, but also on the development of human capital, cognitive capital, if you will, social cohesion, and future economic success. But the most disadvantaged children, due to poverty, ethnicity, gender, remoteness, disability, although they experience the most dramatic gains from these programs, they are least likely to be enrolled. To me, the arguments are so clear of why it's important to invest at that level of education, of child development. To me, it's so clear, I find it very difficult to see that there are still so many governments around the world that are simply not putting money there. And I think one of the problems is that the constituency, if you will, is often the urban elite who are more interested in primary, secondary, and higher education rather than in early childhood programs, especially for the disadvantaged. Just one final comment, I think. As I said, I'm glad that EduTech this year had a stream on early childhood. It seems to me that, at least what I've seen up to now, most of the participants in the presentation, that might change later, today have dealt with advantaged children rather than disadvantaged. A recent study by the UNESCO Institute of Statistics shows that around the world, 60%, and in this region 30%, 60% of children at the end of primary school and junior secondary school have not mastered minimum standards of learning in reading and mathematics. 60% of children have not mastered minimum proficiency levels in reading and mathematics at the end of primary school and at the end of junior secondary school. Well, how do we make sure that programs like yours, those discussed in EduTech, are not dealing with only the 40% who do succeed, but actually deal with the 60% who are having so much trouble? So I would be anxious to see how EduTech, as a process, as an organization such as this, can actually focus more and more on the disadvantaged and the excluded, who are often, I think, not necessarily the populations that many of you are working with. So how can, in fact, what you are doing, the innovations you're coming up with that we heard about this morning, be in fact linked to and focused on and helping to support the development of the excluded and the disadvantaged young children of the world? Thank you.